Adams State College. Great stories begin here.
Thank you all for coming on behalf of the Martin Luther King Week Committee, and thank you also to the Science Building and Dr. Nearing. Is it the Lunchtime Talk Series, the Lunchtime Lecture Series? Thanks for the pizza for the Lunchtime Lecture Series. I'd like to welcome Dr. Ed Crowther and his presentation today, Torchbearers for Social Change. Dr. Crowther.
Kind of like the wait staff, right as I have a big mouth of pizza. Well, it's an honor to be with you today, and I want to thank you for coming out. I hope it's not just for the pizza, but however you're here, I'm good with that. What we're going to do today is look at an aspect of what generally is part of the civil rights movement in the United States. And in the process, explore a lesser-known component of a very famous episode in the civil rights movement, the 13-month-long boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, of the bus lines that were operated by a private vendor but under licensure of the city. So it's the city bus company. And some of these details actually turn out to be important. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the individual who apparently is not here, Isabel Medina Kaiser, who was part of the committee, and when we were talking about what I should talk about, she said something that was both an important thing and as a historian sort of made me want to bristle a little bit. So it was a kind of a push-pull thing. She said, you know, we always talk about Dr. King and the movement. We never talk about the women. You know, and I thought, well, you should take my class. But in fact, there's a welter of scholarship, and I won't bore you with all the details, but there's a welter of scholarship on gender and specific women in the civil rights movement, and that's how things work. These are books that you probably don't own and probably don't read, but they're there if you wanted to read about these books. So we're going to talk about two important figures in the city of Montgomery that have sort of dropped out of the historical memory and what we might call public memory, because that's what happens with events that are complex and multi-layered, that we want to simplify things. And so here's a picture of Professor Joanne Robinson, and you'll see that she's holding a number, so you automatically should deduce that she's under arrest, and she was, and we'll talk about why, because this is also part of the story. But had you lived in the city of Montgomery, Alabama in the 1950s, you would know this woman very well. And your opinion of her might be a function of your ethnicity, right? Because I imagine, well, we know what some of the fine white people in Montgomery thought about her. She was a troublemaker. And of course, Mary Fair Burks, who was also, she's also a professor and an important figure in the city of Montgomery. But because of what we might call the phenomenon of memory, we lose, over time, our complexity of understanding. There's just too much information. And we want to simplify things into symbols. We do this, since we're in the science building, we do this with complex elemental structures through something like the periodic table, right? We take something very complex and we make a manageable mental model. Now, since we're in the science building, and this is still just past the sesquicentennial on the origin of species, I thought we needed to have something by a biologist. And so Richard Dawkins actually writes rather exquisitely about memory as we move from what we might think of as a molecular phenomenon to what we might accurately describe as a social phenomenon. And I stole from Richard Dawkins, but I'm giving him credit, in the back end of his 2009 monograph, The Greatest Show on Earth. He says, here are the four types of memory. Now, I can barely pass the undergraduate level exam on the first three. But as a historian, I better know something about the fourth one. And there's something about the phenomenon of cultural memory that explains, which is different from excusing, but it might explain why Joanne Gibson Robinson and Mary Burke get lost from the memory. Because it happens in virtually every aspect of our life. Just because this is supposed to be an academic presentation, I have to invoke some foreign phrases, but this is a useful term, and you would say Denkmäler. It's a plural. It's a German word that would translate as monument, but it's really a think thing. It's an object that's designed like a memory device to evoke some sort of a memory. And the piece is, complex realities, through our own memories and through the public symbols and narratives that we construct, have a tendency to simplify the complex so we can remember, sort of, what happened. But in the process, a lot of the details are left out. That is, we reduce complex things to snapshots, and the snapshots explain what they can explain, but snapshots are often a distortion. That is, if you have a single picture of a complex event, it's one frame from a multifaceted thing. You might show an individual throwing a punch. Does that make the individual an aggressor, or is the person defending themselves? Or are they merely off balance and it appears that they are throwing a punch? The picture really doesn't tell you that. In some sense, it's a great lie that a picture is worth 1,000 words. A picture is only as good as what we know about the picture. It doesn't automatically tell us anything. And so the piece is that there's a kind of politics that we employ in public memory. When we do things like we're doing this week, we're celebrating the life, career, the meaning of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And for different kinds of people, that means different things. Get on the web and see what the white supremacists are saying about Dr. King. And that's their particular memory. And of course, as we talked last year, what we want to do publicly is to come up with a memory that's more or less acceptable to everybody. And that leaves out a lot of the details and a lot of the complexity and a lot of the things that are uncomfortable. And it often, in the case of something like the Montgomery Bus Boycott, it creates an image of how something happened that is partially true. And it obscures really the mechanics of how things really occurred. So just as an exercise, I can do this, I thought. We'll look at some exercises, do our own exercise in public memory. Who recognizes this? Okay, what is it? Crossing the Delaware. Emmanuel Gottlieb Moitze was the artist who painted this. This is a chance as a historian to show off. What images come to your mind when you look at a painting, this dramatic painting of Moitze, of Washington crossing the Delaware in December 1776? What do you think? You would associate it, and that's, as a Denkmäler, as a think thing, it reminds us of the struggle for U.S. independence. What else? What are other kinds of images that come to mind? Yes?
I don't know what it's called, but it reminds me of the 4 troopers that were pushing up the flag.
Right, it's a very, I have that same slide. You're thinking, I think about the United States Marine Corps monument that's a bronze casting of the raising of the U.S. flag over Mount Suribachi in February 1945. And so what might come to mind is a heroic struggle, brave, and get this, brave man struggling. Now, for people who like to consider themselves brave men, that's a good image. But I wonder if I took this image down to the Dene, to Deneta, or if I were giving this talk at Morehouse or Shaw universities, if this image is an acceptable image or a complete image of what happens in the American Revolution, right? It's something that we want to celebrate, but if you were a descendant of an enslaved person or a native person, You might wish that this boat had sprung a leak and Washington had drowned. A little more detailed, focused image. Anybody recognize this? This happened in February 1965 on United States Highway 80, which today, in an exercise of myth-making, is the Walter Gavan Highway. Walter Gavan was one of the heads of the White Citizens Council in Alabama. This is what was the original Selma to Montgomery March. And of course, what you see are the Alabama state troopers beating the living heck out of the marchers. And that's a kind of image that we have of the civil rights movement. And it's an accurate image of one component of the civil rights movement, that at times, under the cover of law, the state employed its police power to limit the ability of others to exercise their lawful rights of assembly and protest pursuant to the First Amendment. And it's an accurate image, but it only tells part of the story. But it tells us something very powerful about February 1965. And of course, this is King Week. Do you recognize this image? Where is this? Washington, D.C. Where is Dr. King standing? Standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and looking out, well, in this case, he's looking actually toward the U.S. Department of State. But the rostra focuses on the Washington Monument, and the other end of the mall is the Capitol. If there's a high point image for the civil rights movement in the United States, it's Dr. King's speech in August of 1963 at the Washington Mall, at the Lincoln Memorial. This is where he gives his commonly known "I Have a Dream" speech. And if you could pick one image of King, this is the one that most people can buy into. And you know what I talked about last year, if this is all you know about King, you miss the radical King, who says that the ills in the Deep South and in the United States are the same things that cause imperialism and poverty, both at home and abroad. But, you know, we like that image of King. Here it is. Remember this image? This is also, now this is in Arlington across the Potomac River from the National Mall, but this is adjacent to the United States Military Cemetery in Arlington. And this is, it's actually the United States Marine Corps Memorial. It's not the Iwo Jima Monument, but it is a scene, the Rosenthal photograph of the raising at Mount Suribachi. Let me tell you something about this that some of you know and others of you maybe don't know. What's ironic about this symbol of victory in the Rosenthal photograph? Well, it is staged, which is an interesting piece. This is the raising of the second flag, right? And that's an interesting piece. What do you know about the struggle for Iwo Jima?
It's just a piece of land, it didn't matter.
Well, and you can make that argument. Militarily, it does have some sort of significance. But here's the piece. This is a victory, right? Battle's just getting started. Most of the people who are going to die haven't died yet. Mount Suribachi is on the south end of Iwo Jima. You go through something called a meat grinder. That's the American name for it. And then to the highlands in the north. And so you have this image. It convokes a kind of martial honor and ardor and victory. And boy, as a historical artifact, doesn't tell us very much about what's going to happen at Iwo Jima. Almost 8,000 U.S. Marines killed for this struggle, and 20,000 Japanese killed in this struggle after this occurred. Now, this is going to be a hard examination. Anybody recognize this?
Southern Poverty Law Center.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Southern Poverty.
Southern Poverty Law Center, 624 Washington Avenue, Montgomery, Alabama, 36104. I worked there. That's why I know this piece. And my office at one point was right here in this corner. Then later when they found out what a screw-up I was, I kind of got moved. Yeah. But this is a memorial, and this is one of the things we want to think about with the Civil Rights Movement. This is a memorial to the slain civil rights activists beginning in the 1950s down through about 1991. And it was designed by Maya Lin, who also designed the Vietnam War Memorial in the National Mall. And I will tell you what she thinks this monument represents. It has a cooling film of water that connects with the notion of justice and righteousness rolling down like waters. But her idea was these names that were murdered in hate and white supremacy could in some way be memorialized in such a way as to provoke a kind of cool healing. This is exactly what she said to us when she was explaining the memorial. And here's the piece. Think about what's going on now. You're commemorating a violent, ugly series of episodes as a form of therapy. Now don't let me be heard as saying, I think Maya Lin did a bad job. What we're trying to talk about is cultural memory. How we need monuments to do certain things that have the effect of distorting what might have actually happened. Now, if you say you have been to this one, you are a liar, because it doesn't yet exist, but it's in the process of becoming. And here's a monument artist rendering of the proposed King Memorial. And I'm going to guess, on some pretty good authority, that certain realities about Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement will be edited out of something that appears on the National Mall. We will find a kind of least common denominator, and that will be our public memorial to Dr. King in the National Capitol. You know, I find it ironic that when the Park Service managed the Lincoln Memorial, that they covered up with Park Service stuff and the way they arranged the crowd, Lincoln's second inaugural address. They want you to focus on the Gettysburg Address because it's not as painfully provocative. You know, it wasn't done accidentally. And so things will be done here to evoke a memory that most people can buy into, but it have the tendency to distort some of the things that King himself articulated and some of the challenges that he put before the American people. So here's a Crowtherian hypothesis, and this is what we're engaged in, an act of memory. All of these images tell us something, but they tell us only in part. In fact, if I were going to do a monument to the Montgomery Bus Boycott, these would be two of my artifacts. Recognize them? Right? Back in the old days before word processing and we had to take typing, to type a capital letter, you had to use your pinkies, these highly evolved structures, to lift the carriage so the uppercase letter would strike the paper. And you had to do this precisely or the letter would appear as a half strike or off center. I guess when Dr. Savalli was a young professor, he really enjoyed using this thing. Do you recognize this? Yes. And but here was the upside. Do you remember the upside of using this Ditto Master? You could get a real buzz on it. Great, we're going to have a 40-page exam, students, because professor has to get a little stoned, okay? Now that's a moment of levity, but to think about some of the ways in which a movement had to work before cell phones and blog pages. How do you get the word out? You type and you duplicate on a machine. And these things actually are how we got the word out for the bus boycott. And Joanne Gibson Robinson was one of the people who did the actual typing. So it's an interesting piece. We remember the bus boycott in retrospect because looking backward, this is where Dr. King comes from as a national figure. But if we were living history forward, this woman in the African American community is an important mover and shaker. And if you are a white Alabamian, she's uppity. That would be the kind term that we could say today at out-of-state college. I like talking about her because she is a pointy-headed academic who lives in an ivory tower and is totally disconnected from the real world. Well, no, that's not true in her case, so maybe that general observation about academics might not be true. She's a college professor, highly educated in the English department, and if I were giving this talk in a room with young African-American men, they would recognize her. Not only did she teach you grammar, she taught you what we used to call deportment, how to sit up straight and behave properly to show that you are a person of erudition and you were civilized in your manners. And so she probably wouldn't like baggy pants. And she had ripped those iPod buds out of your ears, right? So an interesting figure, but here's the deal. Born in Montgomery County, Alabama, she grew up in a world where for all of her erudition, the most she could ever be is a double second-class citizen. She would be second class because she was African American, and one of the challenges in writing African American history, African American society is patriarchal. So there's certain kinds of behaviors where she must defer to the male leaders. But here's the deal. In 1946, she began something called the WPC, the Women's Political Council. And it's really interesting about the WPC. It's an organization that's trying to affect social change to better the political status of African Americans through the tools at hand. And one of the things that's interesting about this piece is this phrase, middle-class black women. Because if you grew up outside of the South, or you grew up in more recent times, as a part of our memory, black people on average were poorer than white people, and we need to have these simple binary categories, the white elite and the black masses, when the reality is more complex. There is an African American middle class, and there's an African American elite in the South. I give a talk in other contexts where I talk about, and it's in quotes, the benefits of segregation. When you have dual schools, white schools and black schools, you need, I hate this part, maybe this is one of the reasons segregation was so evil, you need twice as many administrators. You have to have a black principal and a white principal. And so you have black universities and white universities. And so here's a woman who works at a taxpayer-funded university. And she enjoys a certain kind of status. She makes more money than the average black person, and she lives better than the average black person. But she's also enduring the feast of Damocles at any point because of what she says or does, or what she doesn't say or doesn't do. The white power structure can lean on her administration, and of course we all know that upper administrations strongly protect the interest of the people in the institution. She can lose her job, and fairly to the administrator who fires her, the notion will be, I have to fire her to keep the funding stream coming into the institution. The point is, people like Mary Fair Burks have something to lose by challenging the status quo. She attends Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which is right around the corner from the Southern Poverty Law Center. It was the congregation of the African American professionals. And so they have to be careful in pushing for change, because if I'm an African American and I have a contract, my plumbing business has a contract with state or municipal government, my political agitation might cost me that contract. And so to the African American community in Montgomery, there's kind of a schism between ordinary African Americans and what they see as sort of the elite sellouts, in their view, at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Now this week our theme is sort of Be MLK before Martin Luther King Day, and some of you, I hope, took advantage of the chance last night to see the film with James Earl Jones playing the Reverend Vernon Johns. He was a real flesh and blood figure who is very close in reality to the kind of heroic caricature that was created in this film. But Dr. Johns was, to use Jesse Jackson's phrase, a real tree shaker. And when he came to the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church as Professor Burks' pastor, he took on what he perceived as middle-class complacency and said, you know, you are selling out to the Babylonians, which is a powerful biblical indictment on the children of Israel, as African Americans often identified themselves with in the African American Christian tradition. And so her own experiences, as well as Vernon Johns, leads Ms. Burke to found the WPC. And you know, Dr. McNeil Smith could talk about how ordinary, that is normal, and how effective these kinds of tactics can be. The middle class of African Americans, even under the stringent voting requirements of Alabama's 1901 Constitution, could probably register to vote. Never in the state of Alabama, you can trust me on this, but I can show you mine and others' publications, never under the 1901 Constitution were the bigots in Alabama able to exclude all African Americans from the voting rolls. But they could do it, they could exclude most. But in a municipal election where you have a large black minority, if you got African Americans to register, you could have an effect in municipal politics, which is what happens in northern cities like Detroit and Chicago and Philadelphia in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And so get people to register. Now, before I create an image that this is benign, the law couldn't necessarily prevent you from registering, but one of my relatives could and might. So there is a risk here. People get killed for challenging the status quo. Protest movements, education movements, and I stole this. I have to tell you about this guy. J. Mills Thornton III is a white man, and he's from one of the elite families in Montgomery, but he was educated at the Episcopal Prep School in Richmond, Virginia, went on as an undergraduate at Princeton, PhD at Yale, and he taught for 40-plus years at the University of Michigan, and in his whole career, he only wrote 2 books. Only 2. But they're this size, and they have no peer in their respective fields. That is, he wrote in 2 different fields the 2 best books. This is the best study, Dividing Lines, on the civil rights movement in Alabama. And you can gather that Professor Thornton thinks the devil is in the details. Well, here's the other piece. Not only is the devil in the details, WPC activism could also demonstrate how redemption and social change could be in the details of registering people to vote, taking advantage of opportunities, including between in 1953, when there are 0 African American police officers in Montgomery, you agitate and you get the number up to 7, right? And in retrospect, we go, well, that's not nearly enough. That's right. But it's a start. And it's a start that the WPC, a woman's group of university professors and public school teachers, are spearheading. And so the point is, before Dr. King ever came to Montgomery, Alabama, there was a movement using available tools and tactics to challenge the walls of Jim Crow segregation. Now, Mary Burks started the movement, and in 1949 she got a new talented colleague, born in Georgia, but Joanne Gibson Robinson, who happens to have left us. She just passed not too long ago, a delightful and informative memoir of her career in interesting times in Montgomery and elsewhere. She tells a story that I think I'll repeat so I can get good exercise about things. She takes a new job at Alabama State, what's now Alabama State University, then it was Alabama State Teachers College in Montgomery. It's a historically black college in Montgomery. And at the end of her first semester, she's exhausted and ready to go home, right? And so what does she do? She goes to the airport and drops off her luggage. This is a before 9/11 story, right? She decides to take the bus back to campus so she doesn't have to leave a car at the airport at Danley Field in Montgomery, and then she'll take the bus back. She wants to go home. She wants to see her family, so she gets on the bus, and she goes through the front door. She pays her fare and moves toward the rear of the bus, and she's already violated the law. And she realizes when she walks down the center of the bus and sits down that she's committed both a social and a legal faux pas. And the piece is, she gets up from her seat and goes around to the back of the bus, to the back door, and enters. But she writes very movingly about how that experience, to use a kind of sophomore parlance, was a real bummer. It's Christmas time. In a very religious section where they celebrate the birth of the Redeemer of humankind, and yet you have a structure in place that says, we have a set of rules just for you that are emblematic of the status that majority society regards you. You are separate and inferior, and we don't want to have any more contact with you than absolutely necessary. And she said, you know, the whole holiday season was ruined, and I cried a lot. Now here's the interesting thing. Eventually she would wipe away those tears, and she becomes head of the WPC and becomes, as Mills Thornton says, really the fulcrum of the WPC, the real advocate and the real instigator of a lot of things that will happen in Montgomery and make Montgomery famous. And so, in 1954, the Supreme Court of the United States outlawed race-specific pupil assignment in the public schools in Brown versus Board of Education. That was done on the 17th of May, 1954. 2 days later, the WPC, having had a meeting, said, what does this mean for us in Montgomery? And so Joanne Gibson Robinson, right, they have a meeting, and at the end of the week, she sends a letter on behalf of the WPC saying, we want change, and we want change now. We'll accept some incremental change, but we want the current practice on the city buses of segregating ridership by race to change. And what they wanted to do in the letter, as an interim step, was to do what they were already doing on city buses in Mobile, Alabama. And that is, African Americans would sit from back to the front, and if they filled up all the seats, then all the seats are filled. White riders would sit from front to back, and if they filled all the seats were filled, but in no case would a rider of either race be required to give up their seat for a rider of another race. And of course, I love this, his nickname, W.A. Gale, was Tacky. His friends called the mayor Tacky. I wonder what his enemies might have called him. But she sends this letter, and of course, the goal is to have this interim step and then move for the complete integration of the city buses. Dr. King hasn't even taken the job yet at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And so the point is, here is this women's group negotiating with the city, taking on the white male leadership and demanding in ways that you might expect from U.S. citizens who are academics, ways that involve the use of language and the use of the First Amendment to affect social change. And they're doing this. Dr. Johns has just lost his job at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. They're doing this without the male ministerial leadership that is very important in the civil rights movement, but they're doing it without this leadership at this point in time. The WPA does something that I don't know that as academics, I certainly don't do a very good job of, but when we have a problem, one of the problems that we have when we think we have a problem is knowing how big a problem it is. And so we gather data to decide, to try to measure the scope of the problem, so then we might know whether it's a really big problem or just something we imagine to be big. The WPC cataloged every incident they heard about of discourteous behavior by white bus drivers against African American ridership, of every time the police were summoned, and so forth, in order to have a catalog of how big the problem is, so they might establish this is a systematic problem of huge scope that might require then much bigger intervention. The African American community is really up against it in a struggle like this. You're not only an ethnic minority, but the rules are skewed against you. So the WPC is negotiating with the city over how seats are allocated on the buses, and you have an episode where a 15-year-old young woman, Claudette Colvin, is arrested. And the WPC says she was arrested for not giving up her seat fast enough to a white rider. She refused to obey the orders of the bus driver to give up her seat. Here's the case we've been looking for. And we're going to challenge in court the constitutionality of Montgomery's segregation ordinance on buses. A few weeks later, Claudette Colvin was late. She was pregnant. The facts of the case haven't changed, but the reality was, at that time, an unwed black girl doesn't make a very good plaintiff. Right? So you not only have to get, you not only have to struggle against the law, you have to struggle against the kinds of social perceptions that decide whether or not this individual is really a fit recipient for justice or not. It's an interesting thing. And that's why Mrs. Parks, and she liked to be called Mrs. Parks. I've actually been corrected by students who say, you know, that's really patriarchal for you to refer to these African American women as Mrs. Parks. When Dr. King said the struggle in this movement is, you know, for my wife to be known as Mrs. King and not girl. So she liked to be called Mrs. Parks. That was a symbol of respect in the Ward and June Cleaver era. It was a different time. Mrs. Parks was not only clean, she was squeaky clean. But she is not this sort of naive person that she's sometimes portrayed to be. She was a long-time community organizer, right? Now you know why people didn't like President Obama for his earlier careers. To white people, community organizers are black people who stir up trouble. But she had gone to the Highlander Folk School, a school for social activism in Tennessee operated by Miles Horton, to become more effective in organizing grassroots resistance and challenges to the movement. But she was married, she was employed, had this impeccable record public and private morality, she's the perfect defendant. And when she's arrested on the Cleveland Avenue bus on the afternoon of December 1st, 1955, she was scheduled to be arraigned at the end of the week, December 5th. The WPC called for a one-day boycott. That is, it was the women's group that started a boycott. And they were going to say, if we keep the ridership off the buses, and the bus company is threatened with going broke, we'll compel change. But we're not going to ride a bus when one of us can be arrested just for the sake of being one of us. We're not going to do business with this company. And so it's an interesting piece. And for college professors, this is a wonderful story. How do you get the word out? Joanne Gibson Robinson and her 2 male student assistants work study, think that way. Type up and duplicate with a ditto master several thousand flyers. And then, so as to make sure that no state property was used, they carefully document where they purchased the paper, where they purchased the supplies, and Joanne Gibson Robinson would deliver flyers, rush back to campus, teach a class, go out, deliver more flyers, right? So she's going to do the job of being an English professor. The boycott was hugely successful. I mean, imagine. How do you pull something like this off, where you're going to keep all African-American riders off the buses? You have to have a good sense that there's a big disagreement with the status quo, and then you have to have an organization, and you have to get the word out, and you have to have carpools, and you have to do all of these things so that people can get to their jobs. And the women do this. The men, true story, all the sources agree. The ministers in the afternoon said, holy moly, this boycott's working. Maybe these sisters are on to something. That afternoon, the male ministers and the WPC found the Montgomery Improvement Association that becomes the organizational arm to sustain a 13-month-long boycott. And Joanne Gibson Robinson was, you'll love this, the recording secretary. She did all the work. Through phone trees, the things that women in the African-American communities and in white communities do when they hear that there's a funeral, they put the word out and they bring food. They take this same social arrangement and they use it successfully to target the bus companies. Now, I don't know how you make a monument to that, right? But if you could make a monument, that would be the monument, the apt, historically accurate monument to the Montgomery Bus Boycott. It's not that Dr. King's not important. He's hugely important. We'd say he's a transcendent figure. But here are his roots in the city of Montgomery. And in many ways, in the way that the African-American churches work, nurtured by women to accept the mantle of leader and social activist. In the end, Middle District Court in Alabama, I got to tell you, as a younger person, and I was a younger person at one time, I had read about, I was a historian, I had read about the Middle District Court room of Frank Johnson in Alabama. It's in Montgomery, it's still there. And this is a place where lots of civil rights decisions were made. I was not prepared for the kind of flood of emotion when I went into this courtroom and I realized this is where it was happening and this is where it's happening. And Frank Johnson's a white guy you haven't heard about. He's a white guy with a lot of courage, applying the law in the face of the same kinds of death threats that Dr. King and Mrs. Robinson were getting. But of course, the federal court strikes down the segregation on the buses. Dr. King, because of his own incredible abilities, emerges as kind of the movement leader, and he's a minister, and he's going to found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957. It's a ministerial alliance, is how it works. Always fascinated with other historians who didn't grow up in a kind of a religious setting, and they struggled with understanding the organizational structure of the SCLC. And I said, it's not like a business, it's a church. And it works like a church because that's really what it does. But of course it's interesting. The white power structure knew who had done what. And in 1959, Joanne Gibson Robinson was fired by Alabama State University, and here was the threat. She goes to tell the president, or your school goes, right? Because we're not playing games. And Professor Burke realized that her number was up too. And so there was a risk in taking on the white power structure, a big risk. And it was foreseeable, and they did it anyway, and they did it effectively in the city of Montgomery. I just had to do this. I felt like I wanted to do this. You need to learn about segregation. Now, how many of you have heard the story? Mrs. Parks would not give up her seat for a white man, right? That is not inaccurate, but it only begins to scratch the surface. This is the exhibit. This is a JPEG of the actual exhibit in Rosa Parks' case. Now let me help you with this. This is the front of the bus. This is the back of the bus. In the city of Montgomery, always these 4 seats and then the seats in front, 10 total seats, always white. If the bus is completely full of African Americans, those seats are vacant. These seats in the back are always black, unless there are no blacks on the bus, then white people can sit here. And the contested terrain are these seats in the middle. And Montgomery had what's called a floating seat ordinance. Because I don't have a real life, I'm an expert on the floating seat ordinance. If black people have all of the seats filled up to here, and a white person comes and sits anywhere on the next row back, all the riders have to get up and move. Now what happens to Mrs. Parks? She and another person are sitting. Rosa Parks is actually sitting here. These seats are vacant. And when a white person comes to take the vacant seat, the floating seat ordinance kicks in, and these 2 seats have to be vacated because the white section effectively moves back with the presence of one white rider on the road. So in some odd sense, she has to, she's supposed to give up her seat for a white person, but that seat was going to be vacant. And my point is to help you understand just how insidious segregation in practice really was. There was a seat for the white man to sit in. Now let me tell you what Mrs. Parks did. She wasn't taking this anymore. She's sitting on the aisle. And when the African American sitting next to her obeyed the ordinance, she moved to the window and grabbed on to the seat in front. She will not be moved. But that's how segregation worked as a matter of law. This is a copy, an image of Joanne Gibson Robinson's note saying, Mrs. Parks has been arrested, we're going to have a boycott. And you see, it's typed on a typewriter, and we don't have spell check and all this kind of stuff, and we have to, but this is how the mechanics of the boycott began with this notice, and it was distributed by Miss Robinson and her students on December the 3rd, 1955. Throughout the bus boycott, Joanne Gibson Robinson, professor of English, edited the Montgomery Improvement Association newsletter. That would be their equivalent of a web page. And you can see, I remember how to do this stuff, how you use the typewriter to create ornamentation the way that you do borders and shading today. It isn't new, you just do it differently and without the skill that we had in the old days. So here's the deal. So what? I mean, we know in the end we got rid of the bus ordinance in Montgomery, and Dr. King becomes hugely important. And so the question is, should we get this stuff right? And if we did, what might it look like? So I will leave you with three opinions. A young student at Stanford University who maintains the civil rights page, and she says, look, both men and women were important, but you can kind of get the idea that the day-to-day work of keeping the movement together was done by the women. Myrna Dungey, and she lived a long time. She was alive in the 1980s when I was in Montgomery. She was Dr. King's personal secretary, and she was the secretary of the MIA organization. Now, when the MIA board meets, Professor Robinson is the recording secretary of the board, but she's the actual secretary. And I love this line, right? We let the men have the ideas, right? You kind of get that, it's the power behind the throne argument. Professor Payne is a sociologist at Roosevelt University in Chicago, and this is his sort of motif for talking about how to express the gendered component accurately of the movement. That the men would do in a patriarchal society what men are supposed to do in those cultural roles. But all the food, all the communication, and in the case of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, whether to have the boycott or not was made by these torchbearers of social change, in particular with Joanne Robinson. Okay, I've talked enough. Any comments for the good of the order?
Adams State College. Great stories begin here.